Oh howdy all, grab yourselves a beer, it is time for some Path of Exile, and in this video I want to talk in depth about the mechanics of the skill Vaal Ice Nova. But before discussing it, I've just dug up at a very old standard character, a terrible one, just to demonstrate exactly what the skill does. So let's gather up a whole bunch of enemies and let's fire it off. And you'll see there what happens is that basically you fire a Nova around yourself, and then that Nova expands, hits everything in it, and then everything that is hit by it then sets off a new Nova. In any case, that's all we have from the actual game client. The rest of this is going to be talking about the theory and mechanics of this skill rather than going into depth about the about actual gameplay. So this is a mechanics video, not a build video. First up, this skill will fucking murder your graphics card. Pay to win has been confirmed. And also, just using the Vaal Ice Nova gem comes with the base version of the skill, so Ice Nova for free, and all of the supports that are attached to Vaal Ice Nova will also support that version of non-Vaal Ice Nova. Now this is a ridiculously powerful, but also a ridiculously limited skill. There are four main things that limit this skill. First up, there is the 800 millisecond base cast time of Vaal Ice Nova, which is really, really considerable. And that's one of the longer cast times in the game, and it means that there's a lot of time for you to be stunned while you're attempting to cast it, a lot of time for you to be frozen while you're attempting to cast it, both of which will interrupt your spell cast and waste your Vaal souls, which we'll get to in a sec. Secondly, it requires the use of 25 Vaal souls. It also has a maximum, so thirdly it has a maximum of 25 Vaal souls stored in the gem. Notice that this remains 25 even if you can reduce the cost to use it, and we'll get to abusing that later. Fourth, in terms of limitations, is a 4-second soul gain prevention debuff that it applies. When you cast a skill, unless you can reduce that 4 seconds somehow, all kills that you get for the next 4 seconds don't replenish your soul count. So we'll get to some of the methods you can use to cheat these limitations. This skill can be used without cheating them, and plenty of people are having a lot of success in the Legion League in particular with not cheating these mechanics, so just playing the skill fairly. So let's talk about methods to scale a skill. Firstly, you'll notice that it has the Vaal tag, it has the spell tag, it has the AoE tag, and it has the cold tag. These indicate the things that can be used in order to scale the gem. So, for instance, if you're wondering if a specific passive or specific support gem will work on it, those tags will give you that information. So this is considered a Vaal skill for skills that care about whether it's a Vaal or not. It's considered a spell. It is not, however, considered an attack. It is not considered a projectile. And so items that have some sort of bonus, like the helmets with the corrupted implicit that gives +2 to the level of projectile gems, of socketed projectile gems, that bonus won't work on Vaal Ice Nova. Now, base damage of this skill is very, very, very low. And if we have a look here at the extrapolation out to level 20, the base cold damage that it does is 274 to 428. For comparison, I had a quick look on what Fireball does, and Fireball does about 4 times that with 1095 to 1643. Almost exactly 4 times the damage for both the minimum and the maximum. However, the sensitivity to added flat damage is actually pretty high for a skill that does so little damage. 70% damage effectiveness means that if you were to use added chaos damage support, for example. Now, I don't endorse using added chaos damage support, I just want to make that clear. It's not a good support for this skill. But if you were to do so, you would get 70% of the printed value of added chaos damage at the appropriate level. And so, flat added damage actually has more of an effect on Vaal Ice Nova than people might think it does than it would on other skill gems. So for instance, Fireball does 4 times the base damage, but only has 2.5 times the damage effectiveness. Fireball's is 180%. And so that means that in terms of relatively, added chaos damage support would add about, would add 280% if you were to hit an enemy 4 times with Vaal Ice Nova. The base cold damage would be about the same as the base fire damage on Fireball from one hit, but the additional chaos damage you'll get 280% of the value of the added chaos gem, as opposed to getting only 180% with a single fireball hit. So for that reason, flat added damage works a bit better on Vaal Ice Nova than it does on many other skills in the game. Like all spell skills, it scales a lot with gem level. So you'll notice here that it goes up from 274 to 428. It bounces up to 300 to 469 by getting a level 21 gem. Now, and trust me on the maths here, that is a little bit less than 10% more damage. So it's something of the order 9% more damage. And that's just a flat multiplier. That is, actually no, it's more like 10%. It's more than 9.5, so it'll round to 10. It's less than 10%, but it will round to 10%. That's a big boost in damage. This means that any effect that you can get that adds to gem levels is actually, Vaal Ice Nova is quite sensitive to those bonuses. So items that have +1 to the level of socketed intelligence gems will get quite a big bonus for Vaal Ice Nova, as will items that have socketed Vaal skills have +2 levels, or things like that. Any of these will be useful buffs. It also means that Empower support is worth considering, although for most people it will not end up being one of your best 6 supports. It might be your 7th best, in which case you're not going to end up using it. However, you should always consider it, and if you happen to be socketing Vaal Ice Nova into an item that has particular synergies with Empower support, then perhaps you will end up using it. Increased AoE is really strong, and I'm not talking about increased area of effect support here, although that is strong on this gem as well. Any increases you can get to the area that Vaal Ice Nova affects are very, very powerful. The reason for this is that this 20% reduced area of effect each repeat. So each time that the skill chains, and I'll just state for clarity here that when I'm using the term chain, I don't mean chain as in chain support, as is given in the game sometimes. I'm talking about chaining in the plain English version of chain reaction, not the game mechanic chain. Each time that the skill chains, the area is reduced by 20%. However, this is only a reduction. This is not a less multiplier, which means that the way that it stacks, it will just cancel out 20% of area of effect bonuses. You can get 10% from quality on the gem, or 11% if you're fortunate enough to get an over quality Vaal Ice Nova, and you can get area of effect on the passive tree and on a whole swathe of items. Some of the sort of items that you can consider, you can get AoE oriented uniques like Carcass Jack, which is an incredibly powerful item for Vaal Ice Nova builds. You can also get crafted mods on helmets, gloves, and amulets, all of which have the ability to craft increased area of effect on them. Not necessarily always going to be your best choice, but it is an option to consider. These will mitigate this 20% reduced area of effect each repeat considerably, and because the key to Vaal Ice Nova is how many monsters it can hit, when you fire it off in a pack, and particularly if you can fire it off in a much larger pack than I did in the video at the start, you have an absolute wave of devastation creeping across the screen as each monster sets off more and more and more chain reaction Vaal Ice Novas. And that's why the skill is so effective at clearing packs, and also so useless on bosses. So yes, this skill is very sensitive to the quality of the gem, as well as to gem level, and it also is very sensitive to area of effect modifiers. This skill also deals cold damage by default, which means that it chills a lot. This makes hypothermia support one of the very, very best support gems available for it. As a result, I suggest that you use hypothermia support if you are using Vaal Ice Nova and you are not converting the damage to fire. We'll get to why you might consider converting it to fire later, but that's basically the major decision you make at the start of a build. Am I going to be converting my Vaal Ice Nova fully to fire? If so, don't use hypothermia. If not, then don't convert any of it at all to fire, and in that case you want to be using hypothermia support. It also gets quite a lot of value out of added cold damage support, And then, as I said earlier, increased AoE support is excellent too. Now, let's talk quickly about why you might consider converting it to fire. Generally speaking, converting, if you leave the damages cold, you will not be able to scale your damages high. However, you will have the benefits of chilling and freezing enemies, which is a very powerful defense. However, if we have a quick look at the builds that are doing the most damage with Ice Nova, and this is the PoE.Ninja site, which basically traipses through the ladder. One thing that I noticed is that the ones that are doing the most damage with Vaal Ice Nova, or well, with Ice Nova, which would then translate to doing the most damage with Vaal Ice Nova, are using the Eternity Shroud unique chest and Vaal Ice Nova without Cast on Critical Strike, because Cast on Critical Strike is a totally different build. That's people that are fundamentally Cyclone builds and that happen to use Vaal Ice Nova as an alternate skill. And these builds generally use the Trickster Ascendancy with the Eternity Shroud in order to get lots and lots of chaos damage. So have a look here. This character, Shori, is dealing 1.2 million damage per second with their normal Ice Nova. Vaal Ice Nova will be comparable. And then they have most of that is chaos, with some cold and a bit of fire. What they're actually doing there is they're initially dealing cold damage with Vaal Ice Nova. Then they're converting some of that to fire, and then through a whole swathe of equipment choices, they are then adding chaos damage as extra. That you're getting a percentage of your cold damage and a percentage of your fire damage as added chaos damage. And here's the equipment that they're using. They're using an exceptionally good shaped wand in each hand, 20% of elemental damage as extra chaos damage, and then multi-crafted to deal the most chaos damage. The most chaos and cold damage possible, and both of these are the same from memory. And then they have that's a defensive helmet mostly. They've got their Vaal Ice Nova in these gloves, which have faster casting on them, as well as cast speed. This character is, however, using Winter Orb as a secondary skill as well, so they're using both. They're using the very powerful Atziri's Promise Flask, which grants them 15% of elemental damage as extra chaos damage during effect. And then they're using the Eternity Shroud to get a massive 5% of elemental damage as added chaos per shaper item equipped, with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 shaper items. This will be a shaper item as well. It will be a Scour chanced on a shaper Sapphire Ring. And then, of course, because they've got the Eternity Shroud and everything will be shaped, they also have that monstrous last mod. Hits ignore enemy monster chaos resistance if all equipped items are shaper items. So they're going to be doing an absolutely staggering amount of cold damage. And they've got the Winter Orb set up the same way. The Winter Orb is fully converted to fire because they're also using cold to fire support on it. But this character is, first and foremost, they're a Winter Orb build that happens to use a 5-linked Vaal Ice Nova for additional pack destroying support. And I'm very impressed with the way that they've built their character, and would suggest that you have a look at them on PoE.Ninja, but not just them, have a look at other builds as well before deciding exactly how you want to build your character. So let's talk about how you would cheat the drawbacks of Vaal Ice Nova, and this assumes you want to do so. That character Shori is obviously experiencing a lot of success, and he's doing that without abusing these drawbacks in any real way that I can see. So firstly, the 800 millisecond cast time, and I had Intensify support up here. This is not a support to use. This is something that I was going to say as an example of what not to use, because this has lots of AoE mods, but it can't support the Vaal version. So it makes your Ice Nova better, but not your Vaal Ice Nova. So let's get that off the screen, because I'm not going to talk about that for the moment. So cheating the cast time. Cast speed is one option, but the main issue isn't so much the delay between you pressing your button to initiate casting Vaal Ice Nova and enemies dying. That is a real issue, but the main issue is the risk of you being stunned or frozen during that period. One way that you can cheat both of those ailments is with the unique Flask Kiara's Determination, which is a silver flask, so it grants you onslaught while it's being used. It doesn't last for very long, but it will give you immunity to both freeze and stun, as well as curses like temporal chains, which can be annoying. However, Kiara's Determination is not... It has a fairly high opportunity cost. You're devoting an entire flask to just going, okay, before I cast this spell, I'm going to tap Kiara's Determination, then cast it. That's an entire flask slot that is not granting you much benefit other than cheating the cast time. So that's one way to do it. Or you can just seek out freeze immunity on your boots and stun immunity somewhere else in your build. Alternately, you might decide that you're just willing to risk it. The reason, though, that you do want to find some solution for stuns and for freezes is that Vaal Ice Nova is at its best when you cast it in the center of a pack of monsters. And when you're in the center of a pack of monsters, you're getting hit. You're getting hit a lot. One backup plan you can have is to fire off a normal Ice Nova first. Ice Nova has a larger radius than the first Vaal Ice Nova does, so you can fire off an Ice Nova, then run in while enemies are chilled, and then set off your Vaal Ice Nova. That's another option. I'll leave exactly how you do that up to you, but just be aware that the cast time is long. Secondly, there is the cost of 25 Vaal Souls. This restricts the frequency of use. In terms of the default philosophy here, because Vaal Ice Nova's cost is considerable, the idea is that you save it for moments that you're getting overwhelmed, and then you set it off, and it is your panic button. However, you can set up your build, and most people that are using the skill at the moment seems to be doing this, in such a way that you make that panic button available more often than usual. And you make considerable sacrifices in order to have access to Vaal Ice Nova more and more frequently. So you need to gain souls somehow, and conveniently conveniently this gem also provides you with Ice Nova itself, which is a way that you can gain souls. Although most people don't use Ice Nova, they tend to use Winter Orb or something else. Now you can cheat on soul generation. There are these two unique jewels. Chill of Corruption, 50% chance to gain an additional Vaal soul per enemy shattered, and Sacrificial Harvest, which is up to 30% chance to gain an additional Vaal soul on kill. These are okay, but they're the way that we used to cheat soul costs in the past. They're not as good as they used to be. There are new, better methods, and so I don't really recommend going out of your way to acquire those jewels. They will work, and they will give you access to casting Vaal Ice Nova more often, but you can do better than them. Your best approach is to cheat on spending souls. Now, if you have a quick look at the Soul Catcher unique flask, this has the special mod, Vaal skills have 25% reduced soul cost during effect. You can also gain 20 to 40% of this same reduction on weapons that have been crafted with a Bloodstained Fossil. Now, Bloodstained Fossils are not cheap, and they are pretty much essential to making a very effective Vaal skill abuse character. There are other ways. I believe that you can get items, weapons that have this mod on them from one of the rarer sextants that was added in 3.7, which gives you the Gifts of the Red Queen. When you create, there's a chance to have Gifts of the Red Queen in a map if you add mortal fragments. So that's the Alluring Abyss, the Uberatzery fragments. If you add them into the map device when you create the zone. That is an expensive way, and it's also quite unreliable because you need to be using red sextants in order to get it. However, if you can get them that way, that'll be the cheapest way. Otherwise, you're going to have to be using Bloodstained Fossils. Bloodstained Fossils will give you a lot of power when you can get those weapons with 20% reduction in soul cost if they're one-handers, 40% if they're two-handers. Now, the thing is that those mods can't be scaled up. You can get a maximum of 40% reduction on your weapons. You can't get any more on weapons. This flask can be scaled up, and it is hypersensitive to Flask Effectiveness. Flask Effectiveness can be found in a bunch of different spots around. That's not that's not the search, this is it. There's a bunch of different ones. There's the Alchemist node on the passive tree and its cluster, which grants you 26%. It's near the Witch start and it is excellent. And there is, but it is possible to get even more Flask Effectiveness from other sources. So definitely take the Alchemist cluster because it's amazing. But then if you choose to go a Pathfinder, you'll get 20% Flask Effectiveness on any Eternal Labyrinth Ascended Pathfinder, and you can even get that up to 25% if you're willing to pay a steep opportunity cost of only taking 3 major nodes and taking 5 minor nodes. So you can get 20 or 25% Flask Effectiveness that way. You get 8% from the unique jewel Conqueror's Potency, which is a quest-only unique jewel. It comes from the Wings of Vastri quest in Act 8. You can get 11% from Elder belts, which have no drawback, or up to 14% crafted on belts with severe drawback. You can also get them from the Maraketh Timeless Jewel. So that is the Brutal Restraint Timeless Jewel. And this is really difficult to trade for, but basically, if you can find a way, one of the things that this jewel does, in an area of your passive tree, it changes every notable, and there's 25 possibilities that each individual notable can be turned into. Some of those will be turned into some of them may be turned into 8% Flask Effectiveness notables. The key baselines to get to. Assuming you've got 40% soul cost reduction on your weapons, if you can get 12% Flask Effectiveness, then you will get the cost of Vaal Ice Nova down to 8 souls, which means that you can use it 3 times from a fully charged one. If you can get 44% Flask Effectiveness, you will be able to use it 4 times. If you can get 60% Flask Effectiveness, you'll be able to use it 5 times. And if you can somehow get 76%, then you can use it 6 times. Getting it to 76% absolutely requires Brutal Restraint, and it absolutely requires you to be a Pathfinder. Getting even 60% for 5 is very, very messy as well, and requires you to be a Pathfinder or have Brutal Restraint, and also to do a bunch of other shenanigans. And so the big decision you need to make is Pathfinder worth it? Pathfinder will give you the most frequent access to casting Vaal Ice Nova, but Trickster will give you the most potential damage from Vaal Ice Nova. I recommend that you make a decision. If you're wanting to farm lower tier maps, then go with Pathfinder. Set up your character to be able to cast Vaal Ice Nova as many times as possible, and then any bonuses that you get to damage will be a bonus, but you won't be dealing tremendous damage with each cast of Vaal Ice Nova. On the flip side, you can go Trickster. You can do the most damage possible with each cast of Vaal Ice Nova, but not necessarily have the same ability to cast a spell many, many times. Even a Trickster, however, should be using the Soul Catcher Flask and be stacking a bit of Flask Effectiveness. Definitely take the Alchemist Cluster on the tree. Definitely craft some onto your belt if you can. Now, the next thing we need to consider working around is the 4-second soul gain prevention. Now, Soul Ripper is the ultimate solution, but this is a 24 Exalt Flask at the moment, and with how rare it is, given that it only is available through the Temple of Atzoatl, it is staggeringly rare, and I honestly think it could be an item that could hit 50, 70, 100 Exalts in the rest of the league. That's because the Vial of the Ghost is the only way to create it, and this thing is a lower than 1 in 1,000 drop rate from the end boss of the Incursion Temple. So you're just not going to see this very often, and you basically are not going to have access to this item. You're not going to have access to this item realistically. So don't count on that. Don't count on getting that, and then you'll be able to. Don't count on getting that unless you can afford to trade for it from someone else. It's certainly unavailable in any sort of private league or anything like that. That's the best solution. If you can't get that, and most people won't be able to, you will need to settle for the Soul Catcher Flask. This is much more common. It's something that will realistically drop for you yourself in the Incursion Temple, and also is very, very available in trade. It has this mod. Vaal skills used during Flask Effect have 40 to 20% reduced soul gain prevention. This is affected by your Flask Effectiveness that we were talking about before, and its potential. If you can get a perfectly rolled one of these, and when I say perfectly rolled, you may not be able to get both 100 and 40, but if you can get a 40% here, and ideally not a terrible roll on the increased damage, then you can get an enormous reduction to the soul gain prevention time. And with that in mind, my general suggestion is that you go with all of the Flask Effectiveness that's reasonable to get, which is more if you're a Pathfinder, less if you're a Trickster, and then use a well-rolled Soul Catcher as your solution. The thing is that this will not, that when you cast Vaal Ice Nova, most of the monsters that die to it will still die during soul gain prevention. So you will need to therefore be saving, you will not be using Vaal Ice Nova as your sole skill for killing enemies. You will need to be using something else, whether that be Ice Nova, whether that be something entirely different is up to you. And that's something that you'll need to think about. Overall, though, I think that the key takeaways from this video are that Flask Effectiveness is extremely powerful, potentially even really overpowered, in its synergies with Vaal Ice Nova, and that Vaal Ice Nova is extremely well positioned for slaughtering entire packs of Legion enemies. For that reason, it's been a really meta skill this league, and I recommend, if you're wanting to feel like you're cheating a bit when you're playing, it's something to seriously consider. In any case, if you've got any questions, fire them away below. Otherwise, I hope you have a good one.